So I'm going to talk for a little bit, but I really would love for it to be as much of a conversation rather than me just talking at you. It would be helpful before I begin to sort of know by hands a little bit of kind of who you are. So can you raise your hand if you're a journalism student? Oh, you were? Okay. Good, okay. And raise your hand if you're a professional, working professional journalist. Great. How about if you're an engineering student? Okay. And then maybe call out, if I didn't mention what fields or areas are others. Acting?
Communication studies.
Communication studies?
Video and film.
Video and film. Okay, good. All right. So the reason I put in my opening slide the point of what I had to unlearn, I think is a very important one, whether you're a journalist, a filmmaker, a technologist, is I became a journalist when I was 15 years old. That's what I wanted to be. And I started doing journalism that young. And I did it for more than 30 years from that point. For most of that time, I never really thought that I was in the technology business. I never really paid any attention to having to be competent at how things worked. Essentially, the tools of journalism during my time, or much of it, were a notebook, a pen, maybe a recorder, and knowing how to use a word processor. That was it. Then I was at the Washington Post during the period, essentially the decade of the 2000s. And I lived through seeing and experiencing the trauma of having a great newspaper disrupted by technology. And in many ways, many of the things that had served us so well over the years, what we were good at, became liabilities as we tried to make this transition first into the digital world. And there was a lot of pain and loss during that time. Newsrooms shrunk. There were new startups that took advertising or audience away. And if there was any good during that period, and there was a lot of bad, but if there was any good, it caused people like me to realize that you either had to change or you were going to potentially die. It was that stark of a choice. And that you needed to start embracing the fact that digital media was not just some kind of easy transfer from what we were doing in print, but that each platform was its own distinct medium. And you needed to understand the technology, you needed to understand how people used the technology, and then you had to open yourself to work with people who you never would have thought of working with before. To give you a quick example, when I was just starting to make this personal transition myself in 2009, I worked on a project, some journalists from the Washington Post, some journalists from the New York Times, and engineers from Google. And we were going to work together on a project. Not that long ago, we're talking 7 years. But it was as if we spoke different languages. Could have been one from Mars and the other from Earth. I mean, it was just different species. And we weren't ready at that point to figure out how do we collaborate. So you realize that you have to bring people into newsrooms that you wouldn't have normally thought of working with before. And then the last point, and I'll jump into my slides, is you have to also realize that it doesn't make someone like me, the traditional journalist, obsolete. We still play a very essential role in any kind of experimental or innovative new media storytelling because it still needs to be rooted in what I call the eternal things about journalism, which is good reporting, going out and getting a story, getting information, verifying the information, using your mind to think, what is the story? What's the news? How do I try to structure this that I'm going to tell it in a clear and compelling way? And then, just as I'm a writer, you also translate things like narrative techniques and so on to new media. So that's by way of kind of background to say that I'm not a technologist. I'm a journalist. But I'm a very different person today than I was if you were talking to me 7 or 8 years ago. And I really believe that the future of journalism is an embrace of engineering and technology working with conventional journalism. So let's start with, this is the campus of Stanford University. When I left the Washington Post in 2010, I went to teach there in the Department of Communication in the journalism program. And by pure coincidence, my office was right next door to the professor who runs the virtual reality lab at Stanford. So I'm going to play you a very quick little video clip just done very recently on CBS News in the United States, giving you a little feel for that lab, and then I'll tell you where my mind was when I first went into the lab in 2010.
Called the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, and it's become a must-see for Silicon Valley titans, like Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, looking to get into the booming virtual reality market.
Seems okay.
For test subjects like me, it begins by putting on the goggles.
Okay.
Do you see that you're in the room?
I see the room.
Except where am I? Am I here?
No, you've disappeared.
I am suddenly standing in a virtual replica of Balancen's lab.
Look down. Do you see that piece of wood on the floor?
Yeah.
Walk to the right side of it, please.
But when I look down,
Oh my God. Wow, okay.
the chasm looks so real, my knees are shaking. I know the floor is solid, but part of my brain is shouting, don't do it.
Take a step off.
Hard to do, but
Okay, good job, good job. Virtual reality is not a media experience. When it's done well, it's an actual experience.
so the impact of doing something with these goggles on is greater than the impact of looking at sort of the same thing on a flat screen on my smartphone.
In general, our findings show that VR causes more behavior change, causes more engagement, causes more influence than other types of traditional media.
Over the next 30 minutes, I virtually learn new skills,
Oh, that one hurt.
like blocking hockey pucks and training my body to react quickly during an earthquake.
Wow, this is pretty real.
But the teaching can also go much deeper.
And now I want you to bend down at the knee so you can't see yourself anymore. Go all the way down, all the way down, all the way down, all the way down. Now come up.
Oh,
Oh, that's the reaction we're after. You are now a woman of color.
I am suddenly transformed, appearing to have changed both my gender and race. Balancen's research has shown this exercise in empathy can actually change the way people act towards others.
Becoming someone else in virtual reality and experiencing this trauma firsthand, in general, causes reduction.
I'm going to stop on there, right there at that clip. So I saw much of that, not all of it, some of those are more recent, in 2010. And I had two reactions. The first reaction was, this is really potentially powerful. The first one I did was walking along that wooden plank, and he asked me at the end of the walk if I wanted to step off the edge of the board, and my mind was saying, nothing can happen to you, you're in a carpeted room, but I couldn't overcome the sensation that it felt so real that I was scared to do it. I couldn't do it. So I immediately felt like this is a very powerful experience. But at the same time, I never once in 2010 thought, I'm going to start to do journalism in this area. And let me ask you to guess What do you think the reason that I never thought of it in 2010 was? Correct. Essentially, when I went into that lab for the first time in 2010, the headsets were very, very bulky. They were incredibly expensive. And there just wasn't the way to create the story with any kind of speed or quality that would be useful to mass media. So I just let it alone. While I was not doing it, this is a woman named Nani de la Peña, and probably some of you are familiar with her. Nani de la Peña is a multimedia journalist who was teaching at USC. And she was braver than I was and decided as early as 5-6 years ago to start to see, can you do virtual reality journalism? And have any of you seen, raise your hand if you've seen any of her work. Which one did you see?
I saw about hunger in LA.
Okay. Same one, about hunger in LA. So what that was, and I'm going to play you a very quick clip for those of you who didn't see. This was the first piece she did. And we're going to watch it, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ethical issues that would come up for journalists as you're trying to do this type of work. But I'm going to, if you bear with me a second, I'm going to try to cue up to the point where we're going to be able to see a little clip of the Hunger Project.
Years ago. So doing journalism and virtual reality together was considered a worse than half-baked idea, and I had no funding. Believe me, I had a lot of colleagues laughing at me. And I did, though, have a really great intern, a woman named Michaela Kopse-Mark. And together we went out to food banks and started recording audio and photographs until one day she came back to my office and she was bawling. She was just crying. She'd been on scene at a long line where the woman running the line was feeling extremely overwhelmed, and she was screaming, there's too many people, there's too many people. And this man with diabetes doesn't get food in time. His blood sugar drops too low, and he collapses into a coma. As soon as I heard that audio, I knew that this would be the kind of evocative piece that could really describe what was going on at food banks. So here's the real line. You can see how long it was, right? And again, as I said, we didn't have very much funding, so I had to reproduce it with virtual humans that were donated, and people beg and borrow favors to help me create the models and make things as accurate as we could. And then we tried to convey what happened that day with as much accuracy as was possible.
There's too many people. There's too many people. Or somebody that's okay, he's having a seizure. Okay.
Need help. Yeah, we need ambulance, somebody.
So the man on the right, for him, he's walking around the body, right? For him, he's in the room with that body. Like that guy is at his feet. And even though with his peripheral vision, he can see that he's in this lab space, right? He should be able to see that he's not actually on the street. But he feels like he's there with those people. Very cautious not to step on this guy who isn't really there, right? So that piece ended up going to Sundance in 2012, a kind of amazing thing. And it was the first virtual reality film ever, basically. And when we went, I was really terrified. I didn't really know how people were going to react and what was going to happen. And we showed up with these like duct tape pair of goggles.
Oh, you're crying. You're crying. Gina, you're crying.
So you can hear the surprise in my voice, right? And this kind of reaction ended up being the kind of reaction we saw over and over and over. People down on the ground trying to comfort the seizure victim, trying to whisper something into his ear or in some way, help, even though they couldn't. And I had a lot of people come out of that piece saying, oh my God, I was so frustrated, I couldn't help the guy, and take that back into their lives. So after this piece was made, the dean of the cinema school at USC.
We'll stop there. What she was about to explain was Then they followed that with a piece where sent an actual video camera crew, as well as people who would do the modeling and photographers and audio recorders, to the Syrian border and did a Syrian refugee camp that incorporated, the homeless shelter was done. You can see sort of some of the advances in the technology even now compared to then. But by incorporating the actual video, the Syrian story becomes a little more real because it's using actual video, incorporating it with the computer-generated model. So now we jump forward to 2014. 4 years from the time I had first experienced virtual reality at Stanford, and now I just arrived at Austin, and the Washington Post, where I used to work, approached me and said, would the School of Journalism at UT Austin like to collaborate with the Washington Post on virtual reality stories? And just in those 4 years, all of the things that were barriers back then, the barriers started to come down. The headsets, when Nani de la Peña referred to goggles duct taped together, it turned out that one of her interns was Palmer Luckey, the fellow who founded and created the Oculus Rift. So those duct taped headsets was his initial prototype for what he eventually sold for, what was it, $2 billion for Facebook. So the headsets were becoming more affordable. The camera systems, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, were becoming easier to use and more affordable. Software to build virtual reality models, while still, at least for a journalist like me, somewhat complex, getting easier and easier. And for those of you who are engineers in the room, pretty easy. So all of those things now is now's the time for us as journalists to start getting into this. So the first thing I'm going to walk you through here is just so everyone's on the same page about different types of immersive journalism and definitions, because I tend to side with the purists who believe that you shouldn't call 360-degree video virtual reality. I think 360-degree video is a part of immersive journalism, but it's not the same as computer-generated virtual reality. And the biggest difference is when you're watching 360 video through something as inexpensive and casual as Google Cardboard, or something a bit better like the Samsung Gear VR where your phone is there, or something truly more immersive like Oculus Rift where you're using a gamepad, and I'll explain that in a second, when the difference between 360 video and VR. And then finally, remember in the CBS video where the journalist was the goalie in the hockey simulation? Well, he was using the HTC Vive. So the real difference is when I'm watching a 360-degree video, yes, it's more immersive than a video that's 2D on a flat screen. I'm still not inside the story. I'm feeling like I have more of a presence because I'm looking all around, but I'm not in the experience. When you build a model that is computer-generated virtual reality, then whether you're doing it through a joystick or in the HTC Vive literally walking, you're now moving and you're really present in the world where the story exists. So now you jump to approaches. So at University of Texas at Austin, in our partnership with the Washington Post, we've done some just pure and simple 360-degree video stories. We've done, on the other hand, a project that I'll show you the website for, and we did a project involving Mars. And in the Mars project, it's a mixed media project. It was built in Unity, and it's a virtual world, and you can actually walk around and move around the surface of Mars. But when you get to different points on the surface of Mars, and we create visual representations They're triggers. And every time you would go over a trigger, something else, something emerges. It could be a video, it could be audio, it could be a graphic. And that's how we sort of told the story, and I'll introduce you to that in a bit. So one approach is you virtually recreate the scene of a story, and that's the primary navigational aid, and then you transition into 360 video or some other form of media to tell the story. So let's talk about 360 video first. If you're starting to work in this area, whether you're an individual or a newsroom or a university, at least at this stage of the game, you have to resign yourself, or you have to get comfortable with the idea that you're going to have to make investments in technology that's going to become quickly, if not obsolete, overtaken. So when we started with our collaboration with the Washington Post just over a year ago, for us, this was the state of the art of 360 video, which was 8 GoPros with a custom mount to do the VR, to do the 360 video shooting. And it cost us about $10,000 US to get the mount, the cameras, and the separate audio recording equipment. There's some limitations when you're using a rig like this. The first thing is you have 8 cameras. So for the 360 video to work correctly, all 8 of those cameras have to work perfectly. If any one of the cameras is off or not working, the experience is going to be ruined. Second is when you get to stitching, and you have to figure out, you want to try to start those 8 cameras, turn them on as close to the same time as possible. And if you don't, you're going to be sort of out of sync. So you have to also figure out, like, how do you get the sync at the beginning? Then our rig has no ability to do self-stitching. So if you're shooting with 8 cameras, there's going to be more than 30 seams to worry about that in post-production you're going to have to stitch. And in a room like this, it's not, if you know what you're doing, it's maybe not as complicated because, you have a basic white wall. But try to do it in a place where, like outside with trees and leaves, and you're trying to figure out what connects to what. It becomes very time-consuming and can look really bad if you don't do it well. So that was our first rig. The other thing that I should point out, and you'll see our second rig in a few slides, is if you're journalists and you want to do any kind of 360 video on deadline, then this is not going to be a particularly good solution for you. So if you're going to do a project that you have 2 or 3 weeks and you have people who are skilled at stitching, fine, the quality is going to be pretty good. But if you're going to do any kind of fast turnaround, a rig like that is not going to work. All right, so we started to put our team together. We bought the rig. And the next important point I want to make to you, and the good news here is you're already doing this naturally at your university. But at my university and in most other places in the United States, this is not happening naturally, which is to do immersive journalism, you have to put together multidisciplinary teams. So I kind of knew enough that if we were just going to rely on the School of Journalism faculty and students, we were going to only be of limited value to the Washington Post in this partnership. Because we would have had people who were some videographers who could learn the cameras, and we would have photojournalists who could help with basically 3D photography. And we could have some sound, audio people, and we would certainly have journalists who could figure out the story, but that was only going to take us so far. So I basically put on my reporter cap, and I started to go around my university and said, who else could be valuable members of the team? And my first stop was the film school. And the film school at UT has a program that's called UT 3D. This is a fellow named Deepak Shetty, who's become my closest collaborator. He's a graduate of the UT 3D program. It's, in the United States, the first comprehensive 3D program in a film school. And Deepak's thesis film was the first one at UT that it was a 3D movie as his thesis. And after he graduated, even though he's a filmmaker, he's come back and he now teaches an immersive media class. So if you take this class, you learn how to do modeling, work in Unity or Unreal, one of the game engines. You learn 360 video from the very beginning through post-production. You learn how to model rooms using things like Matterport. So it's a comprehensive way for students to get introduced to immersive worlds. So Deepak and the film school became very important members of our team. These students are from either the Department of Computer Science or the Department of Engineering at UT. And they're affiliated with something, it's a virtual reality lab, much like one I saw here this morning, that is on our campus. It's called the Texas Advanced Computing Center's Visualization and Interfaces Lab. And it's not anchored to a particular academic department. It's project-based. So you approach the lab, you come up with a plan to collaborate, and then students and researchers work on your project. So they became key members of our team. So Mars was our first virtual reality story. Before I explain what we did with Mars, I'll tell you the story that we wanted to do that we didn't get to do. So our original idea was we were going to do a story, virtual reality experience, kind of mixed media virtual reality involving Cuba. Because at the point we were starting, there was a lot in the news about President Obama and the normalization of relations with Cuba after decades and decades. And as a journalist, whether you're working in virtual reality or 360 video, I think it's absolutely essential to not get enamored or carried away with just the gee whiz of the technology. Because sometimes, just because you have the tool doesn't mean it's necessarily the best way to tell the story. So I think a very important question to ask yourself at the beginning is why? Why is this story going to be better, or at least more powerful, different, in using this technology than if you were doing it in some other way? And if you can't answer that question in a compelling fashion, it might be a signal to yourself, maybe this is not the right use of that technology. So Cuba seemed to make sense to us, because in other parts of the world, you can go to Cuba. You don't have the same barriers that we in the United States do. You know, I can't just decide for a weekend I'm going to hop on a plane and just get off the plane and be in Havana because of the relationship between, you know, the embargo hasn't been lifted and so on. So it made sense. There was high interest in the United States about Cuba. We were reading and hearing a lot about it, but it would have been really cool to be able to feel like you were there experiencing the journalism. So that was going to be our first story. Our initial step was the Washington Post sent a photographer to Havana, and we made the decision that we were going to combine, just like I showed earlier, we were going to combine a computer-generated model of a place in Havana, and then once you were navigating through that model, it was then going to launch you into different multimedia experiences, either 360 video, audio, or interactive graphics. So the photographer went down, and we essentially had her meticulously photograph in 360 the old Havana kind of central square. And then those photographs were stitched together and brought into Unity, the game engine, and the model was created. Meanwhile, the reporter who was with the Washington Post, who covers Cuba, was trying to get the Cuban government to approve our request to go and shoot the 360 video. And months went by, and it looked like they would say yes, and then it was no. And so next thing you know, it was almost 6 months later, and we still hadn't gotten to Cuba. So we decided we better have a plan B. And ironically, we said, I think it's easier to go to Mars right now than it is to Cuba. So we decided to do a project about Mars. And again, going back to that question of why, Mars was very much in the news. In the United States, just like any good journalism, you want timeliness, you want tension. So, you know, there's something at stake, there's competing interests. And in the United States, one of the most interesting phenomenons going on is the rise of a private movement towards space. So Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, is spending a lot of money on private space ventures. Elon Musk, who's the founder of Tesla, is spending a lot of money on private space ventures. Interestingly, much of that is based in Texas. And you have NASA, the US Space Agency, trying to struggle to kind of redefine itself for the future amid funding cuts and sort of less American fascination with the government space program, certainly from what the 1969-70s period. So Mars seemed to make sense for the story. All right, so now this is where it combines conventional journalism with new techniques. We immediately went to the reporter at the Washington Post who covers the space program. And we said, we need you to do what good reporters do. We need to help figure out what the story is we want to tell. We want to identify the sources we want to interview. We want to figure out what are the assets that are going to be helpful for us to tell that story. All those kinds of things that are not that different than if you were doing a text article or a video. And so that's where we began. And then because we knew we were going to create the model, those of you who are in film and fiction versus documentary film or journalism, when you're working in journalism from an ethical standpoint, we can't make things up. And when you watch that Nani de la Peña homeless one, that kind of walked the line, right? On the one hand, it was the actual audio. So the man did collapse from the diabetic reaction. That was his voice. But she recreated the scene based on meticulous reporting, but it was a recreation, sort of like an infographic might be rather than something that's photo real. But for Mars, we weren't, as journalists, going to say, here's what we think Mars looks like. You know, and wouldn't it be prettier if it was a little more red or blue or whatever? We can't do that. So we had to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the assets we could use to create Mars. And fortunately, NASA, because of the reporter, was pretty cooperative. So we were able to get the actual LiDAR data to create the surface of Mars, as well as the NASA satellite images. The next important point we discovered when you start to do these types of stories is the typical workflow of a newsroom does not serve virtual reality very well. And the reason for that is, in a newsroom, if you're dealing with written stories or video or audio, you can make changes right up till deadline at the last minute. You know, you're an editor, Amilcar, you know, it's like you rewrite the lead. You say, I need to change this in the video, and you can do it. A virtual reality project is like a construction project. It's a build. So if you're going to go in at the 11th and 12th hour and say, as the editor, no, we need to change this or that, it could set your publication date back a couple of weeks, potentially, depending on how complicated, from a technological standpoint, the changes that you're requiring. And the Washington Post, no blame to them, but you know, as journalists, you're used to doing the other way, and it took a while to adapt. So what we developed was a kind of a schematic of here's a workflow for this kind of story. So you can see you begin with the pitch just like you would normally, and you would do storyboarding and outlining, and then you would get feedback. And that's where you're trying to refine what the story is. And then you move to the collection of assets. So that's the LiDAR data, that's the satellite images, that's the interviews, all of that. Then you do an initial build. And then after the initial build, you create a feedback loop. And that's where you tell your editors, now's your time. You know, this is a rough build, but it's agile enough to make the changes. But now's the time if you feel like the story doesn't make sense or it's unfair or any of those things that a good editor would do, now's the time to do that. And once that's done, you basically say, now we're moving into a whole other dimension of production. And essentially, like, it's the difference between architecture and construction. You know, you don't want the architect, while they're building the building, to say, no, I actually meant that, you know, this wing goes over there. And then you do the beta build, you get some feedback within parameters, and then you do your final build. So it was very important, if you're working in this area, to think about workflow and to think about the engineering workflow and the journalism workflow and how they come together. The next thing that I'll show you is this is the animatic that we created before we got to the build so that we could sort of visualize what the experience might be like. Is you give the user a sense of landing on Mars and deciding like where on Mars you want to land. And then you get out and there's the Mars rover and you can then start to move around the planet. So the reason the animatic is helpful is it can be done quickly and it gives the journalist the concept before you're even moving toward any kind of building. Okay. I'm going to back up for a second. So I'm not going to show you this for the interest of time, but I do want to show you another important element of it. And then I would encourage you, if you just Google Washington Post virtual reality Mars, you'll be able to experience the project, whether you're doing it through an Oculus Rift or, but what I want to show you real quick is the other thing that the Washington Post did that I think was very smart, and I think it's something that any smart newsroom or journalism school will be doing in the future, which is you don't want to just have the experience available in one platform. Because what if only a certain narrow amount of your audience has an Oculus Rift? So what the Washington Post did was, let me actually go back here. What I'm showing you now is actually a web version of the project. But I'm going to show you this landing page. So what they did was on their website, they created a landing page for the project. It began with the reporter writing some introductory text for context. Then they explain that there's 4 different ways for you as a user of the Washington Post to experience the same story. You can do it through web, you can do through an OS X download, you can Oculus Rift for Windows and Windows. And then They explain, here's the download requirements you need for each. So as a result, even though we published the project in March of 2016, this year, when almost no one had Oculus Rifts, they still got a huge audience for it because it was available in all these other forms. So I'll invite you when you can to just view it in however way you want, and you'll sort of see the story. There's about 8 different experiences, and as you're moving around, you're learning about the story of Mars as you're actually navigating the planet. There's one interesting thing that I'll point out when you view the experience from a standpoint of advertising, but also ethics, is the Washington Post sold ads into the experience. And the ads are sort of like sponsored content, where it's less obvious that it's an ad as it is something that looks and feels a little like journalism, but it's an ad. So we had to figure out in the virtual reality realm, how do you be, the term is transparent. How do you make clear to your audience that this is independent journalism and this is paid advertising? So what we ended up doing was when you start the experience, it says very, very clearly, journalism by the Washington Post and University of Texas is in white. Paid advertising, blue. So when you're on Mars, you know if you're in white, you're in journalism. If you're in blue, you're in the advertising. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide whether that's good enough or whether we needed to have more reminders than that. But it's an important issue moving forward, is just like we deal with this on the web, how are you going to deal with it in virtual spaces? Okay. All right, jump into, as I mentioned earlier, then we decided the next project, the downside of Mars, it's really pretty cool, but the downside is it took a long time. It literally took us months and months to get it to the point where we felt good about the story, we felt good about the engineering. So it's not the kind of thing you're going to be able to do on scale, at least at this point, because it's long and hard and complicated. So then we wanted to do the opposite. We wanted to do more run and gun journalism in 360 video. So that's when we got our next rig, which is these little Kodak pixpro cameras. And they're super tiny. That's the size of them. Rather than having 8 of them, all you need is 2. They're very easy to learn. They're very easy to put together. And you can do 360 video stories pretty much on deadline. And I'll show you a couple of little clips as an examples of that. So this is one that one of the journalism master students at UT did for the Washington Post. And how many of you have heard in the United States, we have a few states that do voting in elections in a very weird way. And they're called caucus. Have you ever heard of, so there's one in Iowa, and it's called the Iowa caucus. And it's, even for us, it's just kind of an odd concept if you've never been there, because rather than someone going into a voting booth and voting, they go to a space like this, and then people get up and they try to like make the case for their candidate. And then based on that, you decide, okay, I'm going to go and be with these people who support Hillary Clinton or these people who support Bernie Sanders. So that's the way these caucuses work. So again, when you're asking yourself the why does 360 video make sense? We felt like most people in Washington, D.C. are not going to get on a plane in the middle of January and go to Iowa. But it would be kind of cool with 360 video to take them to a caucus site. So I'll play a little bit of this 360 video we did on deadline. It was published within about 2 hours. And I'll jump ahead a little bit. So here's a woman with a local citizen with a baby in her hand, and she's in a gym.
19 days ago. So she might be the youngest caucus attendee in history. I don't know.
And she's trying to convince her fellow citizens
I think
you
about
should
when I
vote
was a
for
child
whoever.
And watching President Reagan on TV. Knowing as a kid, I felt that he was a great leader for our nation, and we need to get back to the time when there
Then
was
it's
an
going to
adult
cut
in
in
the
a
White
minute,
House.
and we're
Would
going to take you
agree?
to the table where they're actually counting the votes, which is kind of cool. We just mounted the camera right on the table. You can see a little, stitching stuff. That's the trade-off on deadline. If we had another 5 hours, the stitch would be better. But I think for the trade-off of seeing it on the night of the voting, it's worth the trade-off. Okay. Then next, we did one that I consider it a valuable failure. And I think one of the things that I would also encourage you who are starting to work in these areas, particularly journalists, journalists come up in a culture of being afraid of making mistakes. It's a terrible thing in journalism to get something wrong. But you can't have that mentality carry over to innovation. We don't want to get anything wrong in the journalism, but it's really helpful to not be afraid of making mistakes when you're experimenting with things. So this was a story where the Pope Francis was, for the first time ever, a Pope was going to deliver a mass at the border in Mexico, the Mexican-US border, within this very charged backdrop of Donald Trump saying he wants to build the wall and kind of pro and anti-immigrant emotions, as well as the fact that he was doing this in Juarez, Mexico, which has been a place very troubled in Mexico by the drug wars and a very violent place for a long time. So what we wanted to do was take these camera rigs, get as close to possible where the Pope was delivering the Mass, and really take the people from the Washington Post there. This is what it's like. We didn't get any access that we needed. We were like way far away. So we were already there, and we just decided we're going to try to, like, on the fly, figure out some other way to do it. And we just decided to tell the story of Juarez on the day leading up to the Pope's arrival, and really just kind of go crazy and do kind of some wacky things. And what you're going to see is what we did. And I'll tell you some of the mistakes we made as you watch this. So we started off putting the camera, we just used gaffer tape, and we mounted the camera on the hood of a taxi cab. So you start the story, you're driving through the streets of Juarez.
De calidez, de personas también que sufren. Hay sufrimiento, pero también hay mucha alegría.
Then we sort of transition. We're sort of telling the story chronologically. So you're in this market where the vendors are preparing for all the people who are going to come and see the Pope. And then we figured if it worked on a taxi cab, we found this guy who had this really weird bicycle. So we mounted it on the handlebars of his bicycle. And as he's driving on his bicycle, you're with him. And then it's a little quieter. And you can see early in the day, people are just starting to line up. And then the barricades and the soldiers. And now we're starting to do some more interviews. This is a massive Mexican flag at the border.
My name is Raul Luevano. We're part of Holy Trinity Church in El Paso, Texas. He always goes to where he's needed, and Juarez has been a very troubled city for some years. Juarez and El Paso, I feel that we are just like one community, not only in our faith, but in our culture. Many of our parents or descendants come from Juarez or the interior of Mexico, have migrated, settled, or are citizens, as I am in the United States.
And I'll jump forward. And basically the anticipation starts to build, and then you see the Pope come by and the story ends. And there he is. Anyway, even though that didn't come out the way we had hoped, it actually got a lot more views on the Washington Post than conventional video, which shows you that even video done quickly, roughly, and imperfectly, there's interest in this right now compared to, and obviously you've probably seen some of the very high-end videos that the New York Times has done that are really very expensive and very fabulous. All right, I'm going to end with a couple of other last things. So as we were working on these projects, we made a very important to us discovery, and that is there's a big barrier for journalists in this area, which is most newsrooms, even if they've started to hire coders, and most newsrooms don't have the people with the skills you're teaching here in engineering. They might know HTML and CSS and PHP and JavaScript, but that's about it. And if you're going to work in Unity, you need to know much more high-end languages. So we started to think, is there something we can do about it? And so we came up with a hypothesis that if you're working in Unity, we could potentially partner with the lab at UT and basically create managed plugins for Unity that would allow journalists to produce immersive stories without knowing the underlying code. So we started with a human-centered design process where we brought in journalists from all over Texas, all over the country, journalism students, film students, and basically said, if we were going to design and build this type of tool, how would you want it to look, act, so on. So it was important not just to build it the way we thought they would like it, but to have them involved in the process from the beginning. And then after about 8 months of work, we created this. So I'm going to show this 2-minute video, and it shows how our tool works at this moment, and then I'll explain the next steps.
Virtual reality has been around for decades. Until recently, though, it was ill-suited for mass media. Headsets were bulky, very expensive, and unavailable to the average consumer. Dedicated camera systems did not even exist. But now, for less than $2,000, you can buy a camera system and a headset capable of producing and viewing interactive, immersive stories. One big barrier remains. To fully post-produce and enhance an immersive story, a journalist must have computer programming and applications expertise, rare in all but the most tech-savvy newsrooms. Our prototype is a step towards solving this problem. The managed plugins we've developed for the Unity 3D game engine do all of the back-end work without the user needing to know a single line of code in C# or Java. We've made it easy to drop in a video and integrate a variety of enhancements, be it text, graphics, or 3D elements. Here's how the prototype works.
So there he's just literally choosing which video or which scene of a video to call up. Once the video is there, you'll see on the right is a very simple drop-down menu that gives the journalist choices. So the choices range from adding a headline, adding a subheadline, adding type, adding graphics, adding 3D elements. So there's your headline. Then you'll notice down below, you'll see it in a minute, is a timeline tool, similar to like Final Cut, so they can decide where it begins and where it ends. There you can see there. And the advantage of doing this rather than doing it in an editing tool and importing is some of those are complicated as well, but you're also now working in Unity itself, which is where you're going to ultimately output the product. So now it moves forward and the the video starts to play again. Now the journalist decides it would be helpful to have a graphic to provide context about the Pope's visit. So it goes into his library of assets and calls up a graphic. And then we didn't have time in the process of doing the prototype to get it to work, but when you'll see he calls up a 3D place-holding object, that, for our story, would have been the Pope Mobile modeled in 3D, so you could have, at the point before the Pope came, tell people about that. Right now, we just use the placeholder. Okay. So where we are, as I say, insight number one from the process was the more our tool looked and acted like familiar software, the better the journalists felt about it and the easier they would do to adopt it. Insight number two is we failed to anticipate the difficulty of achieving visual quality within Unity with our plugin. So we basically had to use AV Pro as a solution for that. The reason that's significant is we really want our product to be free and open source for journalists and journalism schools and filmmakers. And now, as a result, we're having to negotiate with AV Pro to see that that won't cost you money if you're going to use our open source tool. If it does cost you money, it won't be very much from the AV Pro license. And then moving forward, our goal is by the end of this fall to add more customizable features, particularly 360 spatial audio, solving some issues related to output from Unity to the headsets, identifying more media partners, and particularly adding among the customizable features CSS so that the Washington Post or any other news organization would add their own fonts. And I will stop there and take questions. Great, thank you.